The Bliss Business Podcast, the show about empathy, connection, and consciousness in business. Today's episode is brought to you by Zero Company, your paid search, social media, and programmatic ad experts.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Stephen Sakach. We've got Tullio, Siragusa, and Maher with us again today. We are going to talk about conscious capitalism and maybe some perspectives on this you haven't heard. So I just want to start off by saying conscious capitalism is not corporate social responsibility. It's not saying you need to be involved in charity to be good. A lot of companies do great charity work. And also you have a lot of companies doing, the token charitable gesture that they'll do and then think, yes, I've checked off the box to create a higher consciousness business. They may also be a polluter, but they buy carbon offset credits, right? This is not conscious capitalism. Where you really see capitalism taking a beating these days, I think, is when it ignores a stakeholder in some way. You've got in massive favor for another stakeholder. So you've got like the CEOs making hundreds of millions of dollars while not taking care of their employees, or where a company pursues profit over damage to a community or environment. Conscious capitalism looks at making win-win scenarios with all stakeholders. So your investors, your owners, your employees, your vendors, your community, your environment, all these stakeholders are considered. And we talk about Bliss Business, and when we do this, we mention these occasional elements of conscious capitalism. And this was popularized by a book, Conscious Capitalism. What's funny is I just read the book Conscious Capitalism 2 weeks ago for the first time, and here's a copy right here if you're on the video screen. And we've clearly navigated through some of these concepts, following, I think, some of the same paths and some of the same source materials too, that was written. And, I've read that one. So we previously quoted that in regards to some of the how well some of these businesses do that have this conscious capitalism mindset. So I often make this statement that higher consciousness in business is where businesses are going to go. It's just inevitable. And I don't really get into the details of why I believe that, which involves like history, maps of consciousness, cultural evolution, etc. But I'd like to get into some of that today. So let's dive in there. If you're looking at how conscious capitalism grows, you'll see that consciousness of society, it eventually is reflected in business, right? As consciousness grows, businesses follow eventually. Brand safety kind of demands it. Businesses gravitate toward that safety. So as consciousness grows and people are at higher and higher stages, brand safety gravitates with them. And guess what? Your lip service to the environment to look good, or your token charity work, it's just not going to cut it as you get to some of these higher stages, because they demand authenticity. They demand love, and you need to start building that into your business now. So build love into those scalable systems. This is what we always talk about. So there's a quote I want to read at the end of this Conscious Capitalism book that I think sums this all up. It says, "One day, virtually every business will operate with a sense of higher purpose, integrate the interests of all stakeholders, develop and elevate conscious leaders, and build a culture of trust, accountability, and caring." So why do we believe that, guys? Why will every business operate this way eventually? Tullio, let's start with you.
Well, you do have to look at history a little bit to sort of see where we're going, because it tells the story of what has worked and what hasn't worked. In some cases, what hasn't worked to our detriment. But if you go back even to the agricultural age, we were mostly focused on trading, bartering. We produced goods for the sake of survival. It was very tribal, community oriented. We took care of each other. It wasn't focused on, making a profit or growing a business, albeit those who produced greater goods often did quite well, but that wasn't the purpose. And often the purpose was also evolving around some form of religious focus, right? So now fast forward, if you go back to the age of Leonardo da Vinci, he was one of the first inventors that contributed greatly to the Industrial Revolution. But it took 400 years later for some of those inventions to be adopted into the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution gave birth to businesses that produced goods for the sake of not only creating value, but also creating wealth. And with that also came those who just focus on creating wealth. And unfortunately, we've seen that, over the past 100 years, not serve anyone but those who are creating the wealth. So that's not sustainable either. So today we have more of a, how do we create goods for the sake of benefiting others and benefiting ourselves and also creating wealth? And I equate it to this idea of the chair. Whoever invented the chair saw these four vertices that should come together in terms of how you create value that's conscious based. The idea was, if I invent a chair, I need a chair. I could sit on a chair. I would enjoy it. My neighbor would enjoy sitting on a chair. The whole world would enjoy having a chair, and I can create it by sustainable and reusable material, whether it was wood or steel or bamboo. So it is a sustainable product that everyone will enjoy. All those four check marks are listed there. And whoever created the chair made himself or herself very wealthy. So
well, maybe. They were sitting on rocks at some point. So
exactly. So there was tremendous value in being able to sit in a chair.
There's a business opportunity, I suppose.
Exactly. And then that took many forms: chairs, couches, love seats, you name it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cabanas. So the point is, that particular invention or product really met all the check marks, right? Personal value, my neighbor, global, and universal. And I think today, as people have seen history, they want a sense of purpose behind what's being built. What's the value for myself, for my neighbor, for the world, and does it have universal sustainability associated with it? And that's going to be so key, because it's kind of like a way of going back where we started to begin with, which we were focused mostly on survival, but we took care of each other in that survival, right? And if we didn't, then wars ensued. But the point is that I think as time has gone by and we've seen the evolution of just pure capitalism kind of failing us, everyone's desiring to have something that says, it's okay to make a profit, but just do it in a way that gets value to the whole picture.
Yeah. And Ash, what are your thoughts on this question as far as, you, especially being like a younger generation too, and consciousness for you has evolved much rapidly than some of those oldies like me and Tullio, but
no, of course.
The silver foxes.
The silver foxes.
To piggyback on with Tullio's example of the chair, if we go a step further and we look at history, the different ages of time that we were in, today we're in the digital age where we have access to so much information at our fingertips. This has ushered in unprecedented transparency and connectivity, making ethical, environmental, social impacts of companies glaringly visible to everybody around us. So modern consumers, I believe, are savvier than they used to be. My generation, I think because we have so much information that we didn't have access to before, we care about more things. So we're going to spend our money with companies that align with our values. And I think this is not just a trend; it's sort of like an evolution that's occurring. It's like blatantly in our faces.
Yeah, it's absolutely that evolution. It's a process for sure.
Yeah. So what do you think of this quote or this term? I kind of coined this a little bit, or probably just connected it, but it's now at this point it's the survival of the most conscious. I don't think we're playing the same games we played back in the day with this age that we're in.
That's a good quote. Yeah, I think we're not quite there yet, but we will be. I mean, you're starting to see it in businesses, right? When you don't come off as authentic, or when you step over the line somewhere, everyone now has at their fingertips access to the world and spreading a message to the world in some way or another. So there is this accountability that's so much easier than we had before. And if you see with the history of consciousness, a lot of times it's that some sort of technology relating to communication comes along that just shifts things dramatically. And so, yeah, now we're at this sort of digital information age where everyone's got access to anything. So, yeah, I absolutely think if we aren't there yet, we will get there at some point. And so since this is a podcast on empathy, connection, and consciousness in business, there's going to be a little bit of history in here about consciousness, I think. So I want to dive into that just a little bit. Tullio had mentioned some of it briefly, but I think when you look at a couple of the last two tipping points of consciousness, it was, there's a quote in the Conscious Capitalism book on the same page as the one I just read you, where it was Thomas Paine talking, and he wrote the pamphlet, Common Sense, which was one of the many catalysts to the Declaration of Independence. And Paine said in that, he said, "Perhaps these sentiments contained in the following pages are not yet sufficiently fashionable to procure them general favor. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right, and raises at first formidable outcry in defense of custom, but the tumult soon subsides. Time makes more converts than reason." So I like that part about a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right. So he's challenging this long-held collective consciousness at the time, and which is conscious capitalism. I think it's kind of challenging this sort of, sole stakeholder profit of the investor, the owner, and maybe people, they aren't quite there yet to fully understand why this is going to be kind of the future. So thinking about like what Tullio said, so you go from like the Enlightenment to about this time when Thomas Paine is articulating these ideas, him and others as well, right? And so we are going from what was this traditional consciousness stage to what's now referred to as the modern consciousness, the era sort of the modern consciousness. And you have this document that he created. And then, of course, a few months later, you've got the Declaration of Independence and, all the ideas of liberty and equality and pursuit of happiness, challenging the traditional values that were centered around the divine right of kings and things like that people just sort of accepted at the time. And then you've got like the Bill of Rights too, right? That comes up. And, you've got the individual, freedoms and liberty, freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and the protection, against these sort of arbitrary authorities. Now you've got some sort of pushback on that. So basically, this is one of those tipping points in this journey. And, it's the introduction of this new stage of consciousness. And the next stage from here, it's really going to take a long, long time because of all kinds of struggles to make those words authentic, right? And of course, we still struggle with that. And it's like, but it was articulated. And now you have to fast forward almost to around the 60s, where you're seeing consciousness shift in a really short period of time again. So you had like the civil rights movement, you've got, the psychedelics in the mix there as well. And now this is pushing back against those unhealthy parts of that modern consciousness, like Tullio talked about, the Industrial Revolution. You've got people that didn't really care about their employees during that time or the environment. And so now there's this pushback in there. And this is where you get that postmodern consciousness that starts to evolve.
I think that quote you said and something Ash said really triggered something. And it's kind of an admission of truth a little bit, at least for me, to realize perhaps our generation was a little bit okay with our head in the sand, or being around the pig with lipstick on it, because we were okay with just companies paying lip service to being good and doing good, because it made us feel like we're part of something, right? Even though it wasn't necessarily genuine and authentic. But the newer generation is like, we're not having that. Either you are authentic or you're not. And I think beyond even just the digital age, we're moving more into an age of the self, where the highest form of business is actually your self-actualization, which is why you have so much growth in the gig economies worldwide, so much movement in how AI is helping individuals level up. There's so much behind this desire for authenticity, where people are realizing I can't count on the establishment to be authentic. I'm just going to go do it myself. And I have the tools that I can do it with now. And ultimately, that's challenging those establishments that were okay with just putting lipstick on the pig, or a bunch of people with their heads in the sand, because they're going to get to a place like they're not going to survive if they don't change and adopt to becoming authentic and real. I think actually, just hearing it from a newer generation and the mindset around it, and even just watching my own children, it's the realization that we have been sort of like in denial to a certain degree of thinking that we've evolved and consciously, but we kind of accepted stuff with the way they were just because of maybe fear or what have you. But it's refreshing to see that the newer generation's desire is for change, for actually having something more authentic.
Isn't it interesting too? As you were saying all this too, I had this thought in my head. It's always darkest before the dawn. And I think in the past, when people didn't have access to levels of transparency and didn't have authenticity, we did just keep that. There was a previous generation that probably did keep their head under the sand. And we're seeing the implications of that. And we see that a lot of the world, the complaint is a lot of the world is powered by this top 1% of individuals that, outsmarted everybody else. But I think now they've fallen back into a trap where everyone's able to see everything. So when I say darkest before the dawn, I mean, the dawn could be this higher conscious thinking becoming the new 1% and actually making a difference in the world. And the fact that it showed humanity that once we came to the transparency of what's actually happening in the world, that people do actually care, that was a sign that we're going towards this direction of higher consciousness.
Yeah, and Tullio, when you talk about like lipstick on the pig, I think, I mentioned like the 60s and that consciousness, it still had its own shadow work to do, right? You ended up with, misogyny and gay rights, et cetera, coming out of there that wasn't really addressed. And so cultural evolution just grinds through all this. And, as it's said that evolution of consciousness is not pretty, but if you step back, it's beautiful, because it's really love trying to find a way through, right? That's really what's grinding away at all this. So back to conscious capitalism. So we have now, like from the 60s, we have this postmodern stage where we're kind of growing to, and it's really this very green oriented, pluralistic, embracing many more perspectives. And this is where conscious capitalism starts to develop out of this. But postmodern consciousness it's not the be all end all. It actually has its own issues, and it lacks some grace with how it teaches it treats other people that it disagrees with. So there are higher stages beyond that. So that's where conscious capitalism starts to dip into too. There are these higher stages where there's things like systems intelligence, at play here, where you're looking at all the stakeholders. It sees things through this more holistic sort of view, and it takes a lot of good from these previous stages. All these previous stages have good in them. They have good, healthy things. But they also have these really bad, unhealthy parts too. That's why no one's satisfied with them, right? That's why we're kind of evolving along that way, is because of the unhealthy side. So if you study consciousness, you understand there are these additional stages that we're evolving towards. There's a much smaller percentage of the population that are currently there, but it's growing. And so this is what I'm saying, like, this is inevitable. This is the future of business. It's because history has shown that business follows this gravity of our collective consciousness. Business gravitates toward that brand safety. And so like this younger generations come along, like Ash, and they get to these higher consciousness stages much faster than before. I mean, I'm generalizing a bit here, not everyone for sure, but they get to these higher stages much faster because that's where the gravity of society has evolved. So, they're now following up everyone else, and then they'll be able to sort of push the envelope a little further beyond that, right? So let's talk a little bit about that quote and break it down into some of its elements. So it said, let me read it again. One day, virtually every business will operate with a sense of higher purpose, integrate the interests of all stakeholders, and develop and elevate conscious leaders and build a culture of trust, accountability, and caring. So let's break it down a little bit. Why operate with a sense of higher purpose, Tullio? Why do this?
Well, so one of the desires, innate desires of all humans is to belong to something greater than ourselves. We're all just desires of that. And also the desire for having meaning behind what we're doing and to be able to make an impact and to be becoming. So these things come together only when you create an environment where what I'm doing has meaning, that I am part of something on a mission that's greater than myself, where I get to actually participate and make an impact. And to do it, I have to grow and I have to evolve and I have to become better. And by better, it doesn't necessarily mean I was bad. It just means I might have to let go of certain things that are not serving that greater good, my belief system, or even wounds. If you think about a lot of leaders who might be dealing with untreated traumas or wounds, they don't necessarily have the ability to connect empathetically with other people. They're still treating their own wounds, their own pain. So that's something that as you begin to realize that you need to, in order to contribute to something in a higher purpose, you have to also work on yourself. And that's what I think is the key thing, that everyone desires to be part of something where they're growing and they're expanding their consciousness, their emotional intelligence, and want to be surrounded by people that are doing the same thing. Otherwise, it's just really hard, right? You're working on yourself and you're around someone who's not, and they get triggered or they don't necessarily respond in an empathetic way, or they get defensive. It just creates a dynamic where what's going on here? We're not on the same path here. We're not going down the same ideals. And so as individuals, which is why the self-help industry is so big. It's one of the biggest industry because everybody wants to become better and improve themselves. And so I believe that this desire for purpose is not just something being driven by business, it's actually being driven by individuals' desire for purpose, individual desire for doing things that are meaningful and fulfilling. And the business becomes a canvas for allowing me and allowing everyone else to step into doing that in a sort of tangible way.
Yeah, Ash, you're about to accept a job. You know you're going to put in like 40 hours a week, maybe 2,000 hours a year. This is a big commitment, right?
Yeah.
So I think your generation more immediately this wants to get to the meaning behind what you're doing. They're not saying that older generations don't, but they also had maybe, hey, I've got a stable job. That's good. I've got gratitude for that, which is great. You should have gratitude. But then when they got older, they started searching a little bit more for meaning, right? But I think younger generation is like much quicker. How can I get to the meaning?
We got here a little more damaged too. So.
Yeah, and to agree with to just jump on what Tullio just said, he's right. You guys got here a little bit more damaged because you didn't have access to the same kind of information that we have these days. And if I know that I'm going to put in that kind of work that you just mentioned, I better be doing it for something. I think that's really what it is for me. It's that, is there a northern light? Is there a reason that's bigger than myself that I'm going to put in these different hours? And I think this is the competitive advantage in business today, is because everything's been done. This is the next thing. And when you have that northern light, and you have individuals coming in together where you tend to attract that talent, because talent wants to be around great talent as well. That, going back to what Tullio had mentioned, where it becomes the self, when you have a ton of individuals coming together where they're all able to practice the best versions of themselves, that's what sparks innovation. And when things get dark and challenging, those individuals are the ones that stand behind and keep the organization going, because they're working on something that's bigger than themselves. So I'm willing to kill myself for something I believe in, but not for a paycheck. Especially in a time where everything's paycheck to paycheck. It's like, no, we're going to work hard for that northern light. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you have to be in a job like you're a therapist or an ER, where it's kind of the obvious, where you do well and you're impacting people's lives. It's finding that purpose within whatever job you're doing, usually there's some sort of purpose there. So there's this book called It's Not What You Sell, It's What You Stand For. And there's a story in there. It's about this guy who's this baggage handler who helps load luggage on planes. And he has to go rain or shine to work, even on Thanksgiving Day. And his son is upset that his dad can't stay with him at home on Thanksgiving Day. Now, you can think of this job in a couple of ways. You can go to work. Maybe it's got miserable weather. You're grinding through your day and you're missing your family. Or just by finding a higher purpose in there. So they talk about how this baggage handler answered his son. In this case, he told his son, Daddy didn't go to work. Families wouldn't be able to fly around the country and be with their loved ones. The kids around the country wouldn't be able to be with their grandparents, their aunts, and their uncles. Daddy has to go to work to make sure everyone can be with their families. So this is different approach, even to a job that would, at first glance, you might not think there's like a higher purpose there, but there can be. And, as I say that too, I'm also thinking, can people just have a little more gratitude for the workers when you're traveling? Because you see all these videos of people on the planes and everything just losing their mind when they travel. But there are people sacrificing their lives, on Thanksgiving Day to get you to see your loved ones. But I think kind of that's the point, right, that we're talking about, is that the importance of purpose is it's probably there somewhere with what you're doing. And, a lot of people, it's just very hard to find, right? So let's talk a little bit about the other part of this question, this quote is, why operate with the interests of all stakeholders in mind and not just the investors, owners? We've kind of talked about it a little bit, but, why consider just beyond? Most businesses operate this way, is that they're reporting profits, and in some cases, this is all they care about. Is that this is their North Star, is the profits. And
sounds so 20th century.
Well,
and so, like, remember in that previous podcast, I kind of had mentioned that definition of a parasite, right? Sometimes if one of these stakeholders is just taking too much from this relationship, it's no longer a win-win scenario, right? It's just one just pulling from it. So, if in many of these companies, they're doing so well, but they aren't paying their employees as well as they could, to make them top wage earners in their business, it's because they've got just that North Star of making profits and not the North Star of how can I make all these stakeholders have some sort of win-win scenario. So what do you guys think on that, as far as moving away from the investors and owners? It's not that you're moving away from profits at all, but it's moving your focus around to having love in these different areas of your business.
Yeah. I think part of the being conscious is realizing what dictated that to begin with, and why are we still buying into it? It's being able to stop and saying, is this really what I want to stand for? Because it's been done, and that's kind of how I grew up, and that's what I've seen, and that's the reward system that was created. But who said it was created correctly? So to get to a higher consciousness, you realize that you as an individual are actually not really an individual, that everyone around you is part of who you are as well. So what benefits others benefits you, ultimately actually benefits you the most. So what's good for you is good for me. And if you start to think that way, then you realize that taking advantage or using people, or whatever other term we want to use, is actually hurting yourself. You're part of that community. You're part of that human system, and you're just taken away from your own system. And I always go back to nature. We talked about this in a previous podcast. If we look at nature is in a constant state of giving to itself. It supports itself. There's nothing in nature that just takes. It is in constant service to itself. And it's designed to last forever and lack nothing. And so for some reason, even though we're part of nature, we don't operate that way. And, again, it comes from this mindset of just creating wealth for the sake of wealth. But if we shift from that and start questioning whether that's actually good for us as individuals, even those who are making the wealth, is it really good for you? I mean, how much stuff can you amass? Is that really going to give you the fulfillment you need? I've met very, very wealthy people, billionaires, who are very unhappy. So that's obviously not the path. But being connected and contributing and community and family and friendship, that creates more meaning. And you can't accomplish that by taking advantage of people. You just can't.
Yeah, the world's too interconnected, Tullio. I think businesses that thrive are those that consider the ecosystem in which they operate. So, I mean, this, like you said, this means balance the needs of employees, customers, suppliers, community, the environment, along with the shareholders. And I think because businesses don't exist in this vacuum, a company that neglects a broader impact is like a car ignoring a check engine light. Sooner or later, it's going to break down, as we see in society and some of the issues we deal with today, and from businesses to the economy, global economy, the whole world, right? You start to see things break down. I think on top of that, though, when we just talk about businesses as that play well with others, I think they tend to enjoy buffet benefits. I'm talking about resilient employees, innovation, brand loyalty, just to name a few.
Yeah, I think, let's go back to those stats, because it's not just saying that you're giving up profit. So they looked at companies that were doing these kind of things where you're considering all these stakeholders. And so it was like, after 5 years, these types of companies had 151% return on investment, S&P 500, 60%, 10 years, 409% return on investment, S&P 107%, 15 years, 1,681% return on investment, S&P 500, 117%. So it's not, so when you're, like you're saying, Ash, when you're able to consider all these things, you're getting more innovation, you're getting more retention, you're not having to spend as much on retraining people, you're getting everyone rowing in the same direction behind, hopefully, that higher purpose. And this is what happens when you're able to get the whole team buying in on something that's, maybe greater than themselves. And so it's not just sacrificing profits at all. You can make them both work. Like I said, this is a win-win scenario is what you're shooting for. Win for investors, but also win for employees, win for these other stakeholders. And we don't even talk about vendors very much, but this is a win for them as well. Or you can make it into a win. Sure, you can hammer them for prices and things like that and decreases, but sometimes that can come back and bite you in the rear, because if you're a big company and you start just hammering your vendors all the time, they're going to be finding ways to make things cheaper, a little bit better, get it to you so they can maintain their profit margins, so they can keep their people employed. And so if you just keep hammering, this has been proven to happen a lot. They're also going to be looking for someone else that can help, they can supply to, and they're going to diversify their client base. And you come back to hammer them some more, they'll be like, yeah, maybe not. Or, no, all these other companies, they're first in line right now. We've got only so much demand we can fulfill. And so if you can work out a win-win scenario, like, hey, I want to give you a big order, and if you did it during your off season times, could we get a discount? And they might say, yeah, that'd be perfect. We can keep everybody employed. You can work out these win-win scenarios, even with your vendors as one of these stakeholders. So it's not just, this one-way street all the time. It's finding creative ways. And companies like Starbucks and things, and bigger companies, they have taken this mentality too, of like, how can we improve our vendors? How can we go there and help them be better at what they do? We don't want to get into their business necessarily. We just want them to be better at what they do and make sure that they're also have our ideals, and our concerns. How can we get them to have our similar purpose? Because that's important to our customers.
Yeah.
So
it makes you wonder how many, you talked about investors. It makes you wonder how many investment would actually succeed if they weren't under the hyper growth pressure that most VC put them under. And oddly enough, only 10% of those companies succeed. So it's actually a failed model the way it exists today. But the VCs make money from their fees. So there's a conflict. It's like, I make money from the fees. And it's so I want to get success quickly or burn you out quickly. But it makes you wonder how many great ideas, how many employees that or founders or entrepreneurs that didn't make it, that perhaps struggled for years after they didn't make it, would have actually succeeded if the model was more about how can we create a sustainable model for everyone here, and maybe the investments would not be so far reaching where, what's happening now in the past 2 years, a lot of the investments, they just went crazy. And now they're seeing a downturn of 70%. So it's a bloodbath out there right now. But it was created by the same people who didn't create a model that was sustainable. So it's like you're now paying for your own sins, so to speak. But there's people that got impacted from all that. Real people, absolutely. Millions of people.
Tullio, absolutely. I mean, when you think about it too, the bad ideas that came from that model, when you look at things like FTX and you hear the stories of what the way that they gave away $200 million and the gentleman was playing video games the whole time because the model, the mentality was, oh my goodness, we are about to make so much money, and so many people got hurt from that experience. So it's not just the good ideas that was missed out on; it was about the amount of bad ideas that got through and the amount of people that were affected by that.
I think a lot of times you have problems because you're focusing on quarterly earnings a lot of times. So you've got leaders focusing on this, so they aren't thinking long-term, and they aren't thinking long-term sustainability. They're sometimes just thinking, hey, how can we make those quarterly returns and earnings look better? And so let's do some short-term fixes because I've got stock options that need to, hit their mark. And so you end up with these sort of short-term thinking that's really kind of detrimental. And that's the model that we're at right now. So why develop these and elevate conscious leaders? Let's talk about that part of this quote. Why is it important? And I think one of the things I just touched on was that, right? You're thinking, if you have a conscious leader, you're thinking a little bit more, long term versus those quarterly earnings. Tullio, what are your thoughts on why develop conscious leaders? You've already hit on this a little bit.
I shifted this mindset maybe about 15 years ago to think every time I have to let go of someone or fire someone, it's as if I just assassinated them. Now, I'm not an assassin or a murderer, but for some reason, it's okay to just fire people and not think of it, without even giving it a thought. But you're actually destroying their livelihood, impacting their family to a certain degree. You're bringing death into their family, into their house. Maybe not physical death, but financial death, emotional death, so many different things that come out of that. And so from a higher consciousness, if everybody started thinking a little bit more about what kind of, would I go out and just, slaughter someone? No, of course not. But why is it okay to just not think twice about, cutting off 15% of the workforce just to meet profits? So, if the higher consciousness is to think about the impact it has on people and empathetically understand that those people have families, there's children involved, and there's elderly parents counting on those families. There's a big ecosystem that could get discarded like this. For what? For some short-term profit gain so that the investors are happy for a couple of quarters. And then you're still going to be in business 2 years from now. Instead of looking at the long tail opportunity. So it is absolutely necessary. And for me, it's about understanding the impact you have on people and elevating your mindset around that impact and looking at it for what it is. It's an ugly thing you're doing. Look at it for what it is before you do it. Think about it twice and rethink the approach. If everybody started thinking a little bit more that way, we'd probably have a little bit more conscious companies for sure and leaders.
I think, Tullio, it sets the tone, right? I mean, leaders are like the symphony of a business. They can orchestrate a masterpiece, or they can orchestrate a sound that sounds like a dumpster being thrown against a wall. Conscious leaders are attuned not only to the bottom line, but also to like the broader harmony of their actions. I think leading with empathy, integrity, and a commitment of growth for themselves, their teams, and the world around them. Developing such leaders isn't an investment in individuals. I think it's an investment in the future of business and the world that it influences.
So you're talking a little bit about having that more empathetic approach. And as you mentioned, you got to have like that systems intelligence, right? You've got to be able to see from all these perspectives and how things are going to be impacted by that. And, not just, hey, everyone hop on a Zoom call. Hey, you're all fired. you know, and if you aren't seeing how that's going to affect the rest of your company or your culture, or the impact that, you know, not just in those people and their family lives, but the impact of what you stand for as a business, right? If that's how you're going to treat people, you know, it's ugly. It's not a higher consciousness business. I think too, there's, for some people, you know, we often lean toward talking about higher conscious business as like these big businesses, sometimes developing them. And I think there's probably small businesses out there that are like, oh, I wish I could do X, Y, and Z for my employees, right? But I don't have the money for it. I'm struggling to meet, you know, payroll every couple of weeks. How can we help them think about some of these higher consciousness concepts? What comes to mind for you guys when we do that? I think for sure that, you know, some of these things don't cost you anything to be a nice, loving person. I mean, what's the expense there? It's, you know, if you're thinking and you're building love into your business, what's the expense of that? Love is a resource that is not, you know, something, it's a sustainable resource, right? It's not something that's going to disappear. You've got as much of that as you can give. What are you guys' thoughts on small businesses and being able to kind of navigate some of this when you don't have those big budgets to, you know, help with benefits and things like that?
I think here is also an opportunity to stop and think about, where did that small business start from? Was it someone who came from a corporate world and they bring with them some of that mindset? And, you know, and also this concept that we talked about this before, some of those very profitable companies happen to be more self-managed cultures. They tend to have a shared authority model. You don't have bosses just dictating. You have a collaborative effort. And so even in a smaller company, if you can create a culture that's collaborative, I don't like to call it a family. I like to call it more like a friendship. If you can create a culture where there's a friendship, where you support each other, you lean on each other, you call each other out when it's necessary, then you share in that weight with everybody else. You're not at it alone, which is, you know, sometimes a lot of entrepreneurs are very lonely because they feel like they have to do everything and they have to lead the whole thing. But when you give it away and you start creating a model of collaborative shared authority, then you have a greater chance to tap into greater innovation, and people will be more than open to say, you know what, we're going through a hard time. Maybe we all take a little cut right now and save, you know, to prepare ourselves for the worst and go through this together. But the only way that works is if you create a culture that's collaborative like that.
That collaborative culture that you mentioned too, that's an opportunity where you can allow someone to be a leader, right? Yeah. Maybe you don't have, hey, I don't have, you know, 10 positions for you to advance to, but I do have this collaborative culture where, hey, you could take on this responsibility, be the leader, lead the team, and everyone can be the follower. And then you can drop back to being, you know, the follower teammate while other people lead. So that's definitely something you can do in the smaller business environment, is giving them, you know, if we want to build and elevate conscious leaders, you can give them opportunities to step into roles like that. And that's, you know, that doesn't cost a big budget to do, right? It's just,
No, and Tullio said it, Steve, you said as well, friendshiping, that connection. I mean, I think really building culture in general is something that doesn't cost too much. But the value of it, it's like the soil in which everything in your company grows or withers. So, you know, I believe a culture in general is built on these values and nurtures an environment where employees feel valued and empowered, where innovation thrives, and where ethical practices are the norm, not the exception. So creating a workplace like that doesn't cost a whole lot of money to do that, but creating that culture, you start to build a foundational soil that your business then sustains itself on. And that is an investment of time. Yeah,
that's kind of this last part of that quote we talked about, was that culture of trust, accountability, and caring. And so, like you said, Ash, that's why it's really important. Tullio, what are your thoughts on that? You know, building that culture of trust, accountability, caring. Why is that important to this higher consciousness? Let's dive into that just for a little bit.
Well, I've lived through it, and I've seen the impact it has, and I've lived through both the highs and growth of a culture like that, and also the risk when there have been significant changes in the marketplace. And first of all, it takes the pressure off the boss, so to speak. Like, you don't have to figure everything out yourself, which is just exhausting, let's be honest. And you can create opportunities for people to step into leadership, to provide ideas and innovation. But it also just creates a sense of we're all in this together, and we all want to succeed together. And everyone feels treated like adults, because too many businesses have this parental child sort of relationship, which, as a child, you're just kind of waiting for the parent to tell you what to do. That's not going to make you thrive as a business. Certainly not going to help your people thrive. So some of that is a mindset shift that some leaders need to make, especially if they came from a command and control, hierarchical sort of corporate environment. They might have to do some healing of their own, because you need a significantly high level of emotional intelligence to operate in an environment where you don't feel threatened by your own employees, to create that kind of empowerment. But when you do, I've seen absolute magic of it. I've seen those teams become unstoppable. And I've seen people grow, like people who normally just sit in their quiet little world doing their job. They're like, yeah, I want to do that. And they step into it, and you watch them lead a team through a resolution. And you're like, wow, where did all these skills come from? They were there. You just, like you said, Ash, the soil's there. It's just, you have to cultivate it, plant the seeds, and then watch it and water it and let it grow. And the biggest risk is not doing it, because I've seen magic happen when companies do it every single time.
And Tullio, to your point, another risk is the endless choices we have. My generation has all these opportunities to go find these organizations that have that soil in place. So if you're not putting that place in that soil, you're missing a foundational point. And knowing that everyone has choices these days, I'm just going to go pick the one that has the soil, the culture, the place that I know I will feel good at being at and work with great people. So
to your point, small businesses struggle sometimes with hiring. There's always this complaint, can't find people. Maybe it's right. Culture. The problem is you, not the people.
Right.
Change the dynamics, and then people will come.
I don't want to hear lazy. Lazy generation.
If I have a couple teams, and one you're focusing on, part of your focus with them is to become leaders and to become these more self-actualized humans, versus another team, and they're just doing their work, I guarantee you the team of self-actualized, or people trying to be, they're going to kick some serious ass compared to
every
the other
time.
team. Like you mentioned, too. Every time. Take my team against yours, and we're focused on our personal growth against your team that you're just grinding away. Bring it on, and let's see.
Right. They will be
see what happens. The other thing too, I think, about, like, for small businesses too, I think you can offer some things like with flexibility of schedule and things like that, but that also comes into why accountability is, because you need to be accountable so that you don't abuse the flexible things that your company's offering you, right? Because your other team members too, if they're going to see that and you aren't pulling your weight, now you're back to this being a culture problem again, right? So accountability it's not just this ROI thing, necessarily. It's definitely helps on the ROI for the business. It helps consider the concerns of the investors and the owners, but it's also this culture thing. And you have to be able to have accountability so you can defend your culture and be like, hey, everyone else is doing this and you aren't. I have to step up as a leader and say something about this because it's in defense of our culture. Otherwise, go back to our podcast on resentment and see how that stuff can get built really quickly with that.
But interestingly enough, what I've noticed is in environments where the teams work collaboratively, they hold each other accountable, because in an environment where you just have a leader and a boss, you can hide out for a long time. It's very easy to hide out. But in a team environment where everyone's consistently relying on each other, I mean, especially if they have some kind of a weekly stand-up or daily stand-up, or they're using some methodologies like OKRs, they have a way to check in with each other. It's if you're part of a team that's working on something and you're not contributing, it's going to stand out. And the team will say, hey, man, what's the deal here, right? You can't hide out in that environment. It actually creates more accountability in a team environment where you give it away versus one where you just have a hierarchy. You can hide out in those hierarchies very easily.
And this gives an opportunity for that person, if there's a team lead in there, to kind of be a leader, right? It's not easy sometimes. You've got to address some of these issues. You're going to have to navigate this issue of accountability with some grace and some empathy, because maybe that employee's having some family issue at this time, and they'd be like, yeah, I'm having some issue here and blah, blah, blah. Just listen to them and just be an empathetic leader. But it gives you a chance to jump into those shoes for a little bit and not just start, pointing fingers or guns a-blazing or, doing all the other things where bad cultures you see, this is an opportunity for me to pull the rug under someone and all that kind of stuff you see with that whole competitive nature in some cultures.
You said something really key. I just wanted to point out, in those environments where it's a traditional hierarchy, victim consciousness is very much alive, because there is the finger pointing, there is the protect, cover your butt tactics and all those things that come into play. In those environments where there's collaboration and there's shared authority and then there's the self-management principles, accountability thrives there, because you're acting as an adult. One, you show up as a victim like a child. I'm at the mercy of someone else. The other one is, I'm in charge of my own fate and I contribute to everybody else's benefit. I'm acting like nature here. And so, it's you want toxicity to disappear, then get rid of that environment and culture that causes the toxicity, which is predicated on this victim consciousness.
And if you want innovation, have a safe place where people can throw crazy ideas at the wall and no one's going to be, stringing you up for doing it too. So let's do some recap here. So we've covered a bit on the history of consciousness, right? And this is why we think conscious capitalism is going to be the future of business. It's just because consciousness is evolving, and maybe you've noticed it's evolving a lot rapider, at a much more rapid pace than before. So the next stages are going to come online much faster than the previous stages. And that's the way it has been going on for thousands of years, is they've slowly been moving up that consciousness ladder until now we're starting to pick up velocity on how quickly we're climbing up that ladder of consciousness. So we know where it's going. We talk about making win-win scenarios with all stakeholders. It's just a much healthier way to run your business. And we've shown the stats. It's much more profitable too, when you can get all those people aligning and rowing in the same direction. We talked about that self-actualization. I think is really important to build those conscious leaders, not just yourself, do the work for yourself as a business leader, but also help other people become those business leaders as well, because you're going to put together some great teams that are really going to be productive and innovative and enjoy what they do more. And then we talked about trust and accountability and how that's key. So in the big picture here, what are we talking about with conscious capitalism? We're talking about moving beyond a shareholder investor focused sort of business and really moving beyond. There's this triple bottom line approach that's getting closer. That's like focuses on people, planet, and profit, those three elements. And this is moving beyond that to adding purpose to it. So it's like purpose, people, planet, and profit. If you want to wrap it up in with a nice phrase there of alliteration, consider those elements to what you're doing in business. So on the next show, I ask a simple question. Can artificial intelligence make us more real? You know what? That's the only teaser I'm going to give. So tune in and find out on the next Bliss Business Podcast.